And so I do want to introduce Bill Eller. Most of you are familiar with him in the Voluntary Stewardship Program as coordinator or with our elections and the many different revisions that has been going on. But you may not realize that Bill has a background in Alaska, and he got his political science degree before going to law school at Gonzaga University and then practicing law for Yakima County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. So Bill is quite the knowledgeable gentleman and has a wealth of information regarding his security studies that he received after that. So please join me in welcoming Bill Eller to present regarding elections training and what we can learn. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, Renee. I appreciate it. I think most of you know who I am, and I missed the opportunity for us to see each other face to face at WAC, but we'll make do here online. A little bit of the agenda for what we're going to cover today. Those of you who know me probably know that I tend to have a lot of slides on my presentations, but I usually go through them pretty quickly. We might linger on a few things that come up, but we should go pretty quick, and there should be time at the end for questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about elections generally, and then we're going to talk about elections this past year, some of the topics that came up. We're going to cover the proposed WAC changes, just an update, not go through all those changes because you guys probably have seen that before, but I'll direct you where you can find out more information on that. And we're also going to talk about the elections training program, and what I'd like for you to do, if you could, if you have any issues or burning questions on elections that have ever come up that you want answered, or things that you think folks need to be trained on, if you could use your questions box to put those in, we'll deal with those at the end. But I also am trying to collect those topics for the training program that the Commission is developing. And I know the agenda or the schedule for WADE had this session listed as a elections training, and that originally 6 months ago was the optimistic goal for this session, was to actually have it be the training that the Commission has required every district have a person be trained in elections, but that goal was a little bit too ambitious. And so we're going to do the election training in September, and we're going to talk in a lot more detail about that through this presentation. But so those of you who are looking for that in this presentation, you're not going to get that so much. We are going to talk everything about elections, though, so you'll get some information, but you won't be able to get the all-important certification that you'll need, and we'll talk about that. Maybe certification might make some folks nervous, but really it's just a way for the Commission to be able to capture that we have someone at each district who is trained in elections. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail as we go forward. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions, and I think Shauna or Josh can help us with that. And we'll take questions as we go. So two things, put your questions in the questions box, and also put in your topics for things that you'd like to see CD folks get trained on with elections. Okay, so a little bit more about my role as the Commission Election Officer. I've been the election officer since August 2010, and I think most of you I'm familiar with, and we know each other, but there could be a few of you that are new to this process, and I think it's always good to kind of make sure everyone's aware of what the rules are with regard to different things going on at the Commission. So my role, as best as I can state it in one slide, is there on the screen for you. I'm not going to go through everything there. The most important thing I wanted to highlight is that last bullet there. Right? I don't set policy on elections for the Commission. What I do is, at the closest I get to that, is I present options for different paths that the Commission can take related to certain actions. But ultimately, all of those policy decisions on what happens with elections is made by the Commission and the commissioners themselves. So I do a whole bunch of other stuff related to the operations side of elections, but I don't do the policy side, okay? Most all of you know that there's one section in our RCW statute that talks about elections in particular, and everything we're going to talk about today derives from that one source in our enabling legislation there in the RCW. So from that enabling statute there, RCW 8908, we get a whole bunch of stuff related to that, and probably these are a little bit in right to left order in prominence, but we have the Election WAC, Chapter 135-110, that was created in 2010. So that's been around for the past 10 years, and that's going to be extensively revised this summer, and we'll talk more about that. But the Election WAC modifies that one statement in the statute, kind of fleshes out more detail about the election process, and then we also have the manual, which does the same thing in a more hopefully reader-friendly type of a way. And then we have some electronic and paper election forms related to record keeping and those sorts of things that the commission needs to be able to certify and announce elections. So those are some of the things that derive from that statute. We've also created, or previous staff in my role as election officer, Tom Salzer, I know you're on, have created this election calculator for you all to use, which is a great resource. We made some changes to that, updated it for a variety of different changes that were made in the last 10 years, but this is available for folks as kind of a, you know, put in your date there in the top, and then it spits out a bunch of timelines, deadlines, and things to do by certain dates for you. So hopefully you're all aware of that, and you make use of that as you prepare your district to hold its election. We also created in the manual a master checklist, it's called. So it's just trying to condense the 60 so pages of the election manual and all the WAC down into a 4-page checklist where you can just kind of go through and check all the boxes to make sure you're doing all the things that need to be done, because as those of you who've done elections in the past know that it's pretty complicated. It can be pretty complicated process. So it's always good to have as much help as possible there when you're doing it. The other things we've created 2 guides, one for folks who are candidates and one for folks who are looking to be appointed to your CD board. And these are modeled after the Secretary of State's guides for candidates. So these are meant to be either handed out to a candidate or a prospective appointee, or you can refer them to these documents. These are really for them. It's not as detailed as the manual. It's meant to try to be reader-friendly and guide them through the process of how to apply to be appointed or how to be a candidate in a CD election. So we have those resources available on our website for you all to use or to point those folks to. And something new is, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail when we get farther down, but you can see the kind of this color scheme of the green and the blue and now the red. The idea is that as we go through and make the WAC changes to the WAC this summer, that is also going to necessitate changes to the election manual. So we use the same sort of scheme as the Secretary of State to revise the election manual. And you can see the current manual is 67 pages, and we've reduced the new manual down to half that size, and really we've reduced it down to 1/4 of that size because the bulk of this new manual will be the appendices and the checklist. So hopefully those are the most useful things. We tried to keep those in this manual update, and we tried to pull out all of the redundancies and all of the things that already are in the WAC, so that instead of the manual being kind of the one-stop shop for everything related to elections, It's really just for those very useful items in the appendices, so policies and checklists and those sorts of things. And then it's coupled with the WAC. So we have less chance for error between interpreting what's in the manual versus what's in the WAC because there's less stuff in the manual, right? So we actually can just say the WAC has been changed. Here's the update. Here's the actual language, and we refer to that, and then the manual just explains that maybe in a little bit of detail, but not quite as much. So hopefully we'll be able to release this soon for you guys to look at and make comments on, but it's somewhat premature because we don't know exactly yet what changes will be made. There's proposed changes to the WAC, but those haven't been adopted yet, right? So this is a little bit of the cart before the horse, trying to anticipate what those changes are going to be. But we probably can release this soon so that all you all who do elections can make comments on this new proposed manual. Did we take out too much? Is there something that's not covered that needs to be covered? Can it be arranged in a different format? But basically, it's going to look just like these ones here. If you've ever looked at these guides, it's the same sort of format for the new manual. So hopefully it'll be more reader-friendly and a lot shorter, and it'll be easier to use. So we'll move on to, yeah, so other things to help you with elections, just to remind all of those who, and to let folks know who might be new to elections, we have the elections webpage, and we have a whole section there. It's a little bit blurry for administrators. So that's for you guys. That's intended to be the place to house all of these documents and materials related to elections that you might need to use when you conduct your elections. So we have that as well. All right. I'm going to pause right here and see if there's any questions so far, if Shauna or Josh have any.
Nothing in the question box, Bill.
Yeah, no hands up, but don't forget to use the questions box or raise your hand if you've got a question at this point.
All right, great. So we'll keep going. So we'll talk a little bit just to get us all on the same page about what the election cycle looks like. So shortly, in 2 more months, we pretty much start elections all over again. I know we just finished last month, but those of you who've done this a while know that kind of the off-season cycle for elections is when you do all your paperwork and get all your stuff ready for the next cycle. So the idea here between August and October is to get election training done, and the webinar will still be having the election webinar, I believe. We haven't really tied that in with the training. We might not need one or the other. We might not need the webinar, I guess, if we're doing the training, but we haven't really decided that yet. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. Review your procedures and adopt policies. That's the best time to do it before you get into the heart of election season. October, December, that's when you do your main advertising for the election. So this is the minimum required by the commission for your election. Again, you guys are always, districts are always free to do more. So you advertise before your board meeting that you're going to have a board meeting to determine the time, place, and manner of the election. You have that board meeting where you adopt the election resolution, and then you advertise immediately after the results of that meeting. So you advertise the time, place, and manner of the election. So it's trying to reduce that very, very complicated process into something very simple, as kind of a before, during, and after, I guess. And then January to March, you have your election. You process all your election forms. And that's also when you do appointments, right? The deadline for a full-term appointment position is March 31st of every year. And I can tell you, one of the things we continue to struggle with is this advertising for appointments. Not every district does it at the same time they do their advertising for elections, which is fine. We allow for that in the process. But then the problem becomes you forget to do the advertising for the appointed positions later. And then you end up with a situation where you have to advertise for a midterm because you've missed the deadline for the full term, and it just kind of becomes more of a headache for you. So you might want to consider, if you don't already do it, advertise both positions at the same time. The commission will let you know September, October, I think, about what positions are up for appointed terms, full terms. You probably have a good idea of that anyway at your district. But I would just kind of as a best practice recommend that you do that at the same time as elections so you don't forget. And again, you can always advertise more. You can put notices on your web page once you get that the formal notices out of the way, so you won't miss that March 31st deadline for applications. And then by the end of April, you finish processing all your forms. The two main forms for the commission, the electronic form number 1 and 2, those should all be done by the end of April so that the commission staff can go through and look at all the elections and make its recommendation to the commission on the 3rd Thursday in May, where the commission certifies and announces the elections and also makes the appointments for full-term positions, and that's when new supervisors can begin their duties. So that's the whole process in a nutshell. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the election data for this past year, and then after this we'll pause and take some questions if we had any. So I know this is a little bit blurry, but really this is just to give you a sense of where every district had set their election, and the boxes in the districts in red are the ones that actually held elections. So all the other ones, the districts had set an election, but were able to cancel that election because only the incumbent was the person who filed to run as a candidate. So you can see they're all over the map. This year we didn't have too many in January, we're more in February and March. And then we'll talk a little bit down here at the end of March. These 3 districts, Franklin, Grays Harbor, and Pierce, those were the 3 that really were impacted a lot by the COVID pandemic issues and social distancing and that sort of thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Oh, yeah, okay, so yeah, as you probably, most of you know, the conservation districts have an ability to cancel an election. Well, actually, the WAC actually tells them that they must cancel the election if certain conditions are met, and those are the conditions listed for you in those bullet points. So if no other candidate files by the candidate filing deadline, and if the candidate filed the candidate information by that candidate filing deadline, and there's no problem with that, you know, with the information they filed, it's all good. And they also filed the nominating petition, and they have 25 ballot nominators. If they have those 3 things, then the election must be canceled, is what the WAC says. And 32 of 45 CDs did that this year. So you can see the trend since the inception of this option for districts in 2011 calendar year. You can see the percentage of districts that have had that happen. So from a low of 40 to what, a high of 78 there, which is fairly roughly in line with general election process related to the number of candidates. What I mean by that is single candidate running for a seat. It's fairly in line with that. It might be slightly higher than that, but runs pretty close to that. The number of candidates we've had over the years since 2009, actually. So was it, I think it was 2015 that we went to 45 districts. So before that we had 47. So you can see we've been pretty consistent. Every now and again we get a little bump up in having more than 1 or 2 candidates per district, with the high being in 2019. I think there we had 8 candidates in King, I think, which I believe is the most we've had since I've been doing elections in one district. Total number of ballots cast, you can see from 2011 through this year, kind of all over the map, from the low of 673 in 2013 to a high of 8,813 last year. So I think you can see that the trend has been increasing, that there is a voter participation in CD elections based on this graph. I haven't done the math to figure out what that looks like, but you can see the trend there yourself. And I think that's a good thing. I think we have a long way to go with that, but the trend is still on the up and up, I guess. And the number of elections that commission staff have been able to observe. So what we like to do at the commission, if we have an ability to, and if the regional managers are available, and usually we like to have the regional managers go and observe elections, not only to observe the election, but that they can also serve as a resource as much as they can in that process as you're conducting election, in-person election, counting ballots and that sort of thing. All right, so I'm going to pause there before we jump into a few topics of interest that happened this year and see if there's any questions.
Nothing in the question box, Bill.
Yeah.
All right, great.
And no hands up, but this is your chance. So put your hand up if you have a question.
And there'll be more chances, so no worries. We'll get to some topics here that might generate some questions. So things that happened this year that were a little unique or unusual. One was an electronic election, or online election, or internet election, or smartphone election, or however you want to call it. The way I think of it is an electronic election, because that's the way the manual kind of talks about it. It's an election beyond a mail-in, beyond your traditional vote in person type of election. And King CD had an election like that this year, which generated a lot of interest in CD elections. And it went off smoothly, I think. So if you want more details about how that is going to be run, I would suggest contacting King CD. And I think we might be hearing more about that in the future here shortly. But let's move on to the next issue that came immediately on the heels of that one, was having an election during a pandemic. So as I already mentioned, Franklin, Grays Harbor, and Pierce had that happen to them. The good thing for Franklin and Grays Harbor was Franklin had no voters and no candidates. So really wasn't an issue for them. They had the office open for the 4 hours and didn't have anyone come through the door. Grays Harbor, they had one voter that they had to accommodate. Pierce, it was a little bit different situation. They had more voters. They had two candidates. So what they did is they took some steps to accommodate the social distancing factor, and delivered ballots on request to voters so that they could be mailed back into the district, and they extended the postmark date beyond the end of the deadline for their election, because they knew that if they were taking those requests in right up to the date of election, that some of those ballots would take some additional days to come in. And they did this all in keeping the commission in the loop on all that, which is a good thing, good practice. And also didn't have any issues with that process that they crafted, which is a good, fast thinking for them, because that, as we all know, the pandemic has kind of taken over a lot of our lives here for the last few months. So an issue for all you all doing elections this fall or this coming winter is, should your district consider holding your election by mail-in ballot only if you traditionally use a poll site election? It's something that you should be thinking about. And I can tell you lots of other folks are thinking about it, because you probably heard this issue's kind of picked up steam over the last few months, but not every state in our, as you guys know, in our state, it's general election process is mail-in. Not every state has that. So on the national level, they're looking at mail-in voting and the issues that might come up with that, both pros and cons. And this slide isn't meant to give any of you the definitive statement on one way to go or the other. These are just some of the things that I've seen in the literature related to this topic. It might increase your workload up front a little, and also on the back end, but you might get more voter turnout. But then there's some research that suggests not so much, conflicting research, I think I call it. So again, I'm not taking a position one way or another, just providing you some information as you go back to your boards and think about what your elections will look like if we are still under the social distancing. I know some counties are. Here in Yakima County, we're still in phase 1. Some of the rest of you might be a lot more advanced than we are. Might not be an issue so much for you, but it could be. One other issue that came up during the last election cycle, we had one district that had an issue with their candidate statements. So as probably most of you know, candidates in our elections can provide a candidate statement, just like they do in a general election. But we don't have a set policy on that. We have a recommended policy that you can adopt in the election manual. So it's up to each district to decide how they're going to handle those candidate statements. So these are statements from the candidate that explain where the candidate explains themselves and why they want to be on the board to the voters, right? So in this particular district had the good thing is they had a policy on candidate statements. I guess the downside was they didn't apply that policy to the candidate statements. They took the statements in and published the statements without looking at them in so much detail, because had they looked at them, they would have noticed that there was a statement from a current supervisor in the statement. So there was a question there about is that supervisor as the district taking an official position on one of the candidates? So we had to do an investigation of that and didn't find that to be the case. But it's a good thing to remind staff and supervisors that they're not to take an official position on a candidate according to the WAC, and to also apply your own candidate statement policy, which would have taught that issue and would have taken care of it right off the bat and wouldn't have gone any farther for folks to be concerned about. So, all right, those were kind of the big issues or other exciting things that happened during this past election cycle. Now we're going to talk about probably why most of you are here, the changes that are coming. So I'm going to keep going unless anyone interrupts me with a question, because we're getting close to the end of the presentation, then we can just throw it open for questions. But so as you all know, on a routine basis, every year after elections, at least since I've been doing the elections, we look back on what has happened during the election cycle and see if there's something we can improve in the election process. And if we can do that in a way that doesn't require cracking open the WAC, which is a long, involved process, then we make those changes. We suggest those changes to commission and they agree to make them or not. And as you all, if you've been doing it for a while, know, we've made a number of those changes over the years. But around, I want to say 2017-ish, we started seeing some issues come up that would necessitate a change to the WAC. So we started collecting those because we knew if we're gonna make one change, there's probably a few others that need to be made to the WAC, and economy of scale, get it all done at the same time, kind of thing. So we took that to the commission back in 2018, and we've been having talks about it ever since. And you can see there's 3 bullets there: changes to the WAC, mandatory election training for CDs, and some legislation to amend the public disclosure law related to some CD election stuff. So we'll talk about each one of those. So the way this all works, again, just to review, is you've got that one statement in our RCW, and that has led to the creation of the WAC. So we're talking now about all these changes in the WAC primarily that have been out for the past year or so, at least, I want to say. So we started in 2018 in September, where we presented to the commission a number of changes, and the commission said, yes, go ahead and start that process. So we went out and gathered some support from the CDs, and we created the CDEAC committee, the CD Election and Appointment Committee. They worked for 6 months or so through early 2019, finished their work over the summer. We presented that back to the commission, and that CDAC, those folks were CD folks, supervisors and staff, and some commission staff, some of you I think on the line right now. And the commission said, great, and put that back out to the districts last September. And we got some comments on those. And then in December of last year, they said, go ahead and pursue the formal WAC adoption process with that. So we've been working on that ever since. In March, the commission took made two little tweaks to that, to the suite of changes that were proposed. They removed the one proposal, which was to set all elections during the second week of March. They took that one out of the bunch that was set to be changed. And they also made a slight change, recommended a change to one of the WACs, which is the one related to canceling the election if only one candidate files. They wanted to put a recommendation in there from the staff to not adopt this provision in the package, but they left that one in. So it's still in, but it's kind of, I would call it disfavored at this point. So all of those WAC changes have been put on a web page that we created last month, and it should be available if you go to our elections page. There's a link there to that. And we started that WAC adoption process, which if you're at all involved in it, you have to go deal with the code revisor's office and file a number of forms. So we filed those forms. You can see the dates there as when they were filed or about to be filed. I think we're going to have the next one coming up next week. And then we're going to have two public hearings, one in Spokane, August 6th at 3 p.m. at the Spokane CD, and the other in Puyallup, August 11th at 3 p.m. And right now, both of those are still in-person and a webinar option. That may change depending on if we can't have meetings of more than 5 or 10 people. I forget which phase those are, but we'll be checking that as we get closer. And it might just be a situation where we're having the hearing and taking public comment by the web. But as we get closer, we'll know more, and we'll update the web page, and I'm sure we'll be sending out a notice through the Gov delivery system to let folks know too. The idea would be that the formal comment would go until September 1st, and there is a comment form that's already live for you to make comments on. And if you've made comments in the past, those comments were already kind of incorporated. But if you feel really passionate about a particular change, I would go ahead and make sure you make a comment through this process, because this is the formal WAC adoption process. So you'll definitely get a response one way or another if you didn't in the past, but you should have gotten one in the past. I'm fairly confident you would have, but this is the best way to do that, through that comment form. And then we're going to create a responsiveness document for the commission, with the idea being that at their September 17 meeting, they would adopt the changes formally, and then by November, they'd be in place for this next coming election cycle. So that's a lot to get through for this summer. And then in the meantime, all of those things that I already showed you, the forms, the manual, webpage, guides, all of that would need to be updated to reflect those changes. And you've probably seen those changes. There's 70 different changes, but really about 20 are substantive, 20, 25. Most of them are slight language changes. All right, let's move on from there. A commission motion from last December. Yes, so the other thing last December was one of the other proposals we brought out of the CDAC process was that there should be a point person at, and there is right now, there's the election supervisor, right? There's one staff person at every CD that's responsible for running the election. The problem is there's nothing that requires that person to be trained in how to run an election. So we were trying to bring that issue up a little bit more and make sure that we raise the standard for everybody, in that we have a policy at the commission now, because they've adopted one that says every district will have at least one person who's trained in running CD elections. So the CDAC originally proposed that, and the way they proposed it was running that through the CTD and having them house that process. Commission staff since that time has discussed that option and found that not to be feasible. So we went with the solution there in the last full bullet is to hold webinars. They would have been in person, but because of the pandemic, they're now going to be web trainings in September. And the idea is they're going to be about 3 to 4 hours each, and the CD staff would be responsible, who are responsible for elections. They would attend one of those sessions, and you can either participate live or you can watch a recording of it. And then you would certify that. You would basically check a box on the EF1 form that you have attended that, you have taken that training. Okay. The commission also recommends that more than one person actually have that, because we've had a number of situations where the election supervisor has had an emergency and has not been available for the election, and then someone else has to do it. And if that person isn't trained, then you're really at a disadvantage. So we recommend having a backup person be trained as well, but at this point they're not requiring that. So that's kind of the simplified process for that. And unfortunately, we don't have the curriculum developed yet for these trainings. That's one of the things on my to-do list to get done over the summer. So that's one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar was, if you have any topics you'd like to see specifically addressed, shoot those to me either right now or by email, because we're developing that curriculum. And I can tell you it's going to be based off the same sort of training that the Secretary of State does for the general election process. And they have a giant manual for that. Comes in its own 3-ring binder, and hopefully we won't have that much for you in ours, but it's going to cover everything you would need to know to run a CD election. I think this is about the last thing I have for you. We're also still pursuing a fix to the RCW, and this is related to an issue that's been out for I think since 2018, related to the disclosure of emails and phone numbers, and email addresses and phone numbers for folks who request ballots in CD elections. Those are not confidential under the Public Disclosure Act. So to fix that, we would need a legislative change, and that's one of the things that the CDAC recommended, and the commission has agreed to pursue. So our policy staff is going to be pursuing that this coming legislative session. So yeah, here is my attempt to get some of your thoughts on what are the topics for the elections training. Definitely, we're going to be talking about, because this is a transition year from how elections are conducted now to what the changes are going to, how the changes are going to affect that. That is definitely going to be high on the list of what we're going to cover. But we also need to know just generally how elections go, right? So we're going to be talking about the changes in the WAC. We're going to be going over the new election manual and the election form changes, because those are kind of nuts and bolts things of how to get the elections done. And we're looking for other suggestions as well. But that takes me to the end of my presentation. And I will throw it open for any questions.
So far, no hands up, Bill. How about the questions box, Josh?
Yeah, we've got two. We'll start with the first one, Bill, and this is from Audrey. And she's asking if a supervisor allowed to make his or her own candidate statement if that person is not allowed to make a statement as a supervisor.
Yeah, that gets at that official, in your official capacity. If you're talking not in your official capacity, you can. The First Amendment still applies to everybody. It's just when you are acting in your official capacity and either the district or the supervisor makes a statement in that capacity that you're going to be in trouble.
Thank you. And the next question is from a district manager who related to the election survey. They said that one of the options that their board was very interested in was the ability to have board members approve rates and charges. Do you have any information, or can you speak to whether this was considered or still being considered as a change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I can tell you about that is the policy side here at the commission put out that survey. The background related to that is because, as you probably recall, over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk in the legislature, in the media, about CD elections, special purpose district elections. So we were trying to gather some data, opinions, and other materials to present that information to legislators when they're talking through these issues. And I think that's where that survey got generated out of. I can't tell you where that's going to go in the future. I know the thought was before the pandemic that CD elections and special purpose district elections would be coming up again in the next legislative session. But really, that's a question that I can bring back to the policy side folks, and they can get back to you on, because that's something they handle. I think would probably be good, and that's a good thing to kind of update folks on, is where we are with the policy side of elections. Yeah.
Okay, there's a few more trickling in, unless, Shauna, there's some hands raised.
I don't see any hands, so keep going, Josh.
Okay, question / comment from B, and this relates to maybe part of the training, but it was the thought about developing a toolkit that CDs could use to promote elections, so that there's some uniformity in the way we promote, and also resources that smaller CDs can use.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We already have in the election manual some examples for notices. So, but it would be nice to have more than that. And I also have heard, kind of in conjunction with, if we go to it was kind of in conjunction with the concept of moving to districts going to just 1 week, and having the commission promote that on a statewide basis, in having some publicity and outreach and other things. So kind of working in partnership with districts in that effort. It's much more difficult to do that, I think, at least kind of channeling what I've heard from the commissioners in the past with the current system, because districts can have their elections over 3 months, right? So the idea would be to generate that sort of publicity in a 1 week or right before that week media campaign. But we can talk about putting out more than what we already have in the manual related to a toolkit to promote elections. And I think that would be something that we could work with our communications folks at the commission to see if they can come up with some materials there, because I know we've done it in other programs. In the VSP program, we have some of those materials available for counties to use. So that's something that we should be able to put together, I would imagine, for districts to use if they don't already have it. And you guys probably have some good examples yourselves of things that you have done in the past. So maybe that's the kind of thing that we can gather together. Yeah.
Okay, a couple related to the WAC change, and these two I think are asking about whether this is current practice or proposed practice, just maybe clarifying. The first question was whether they were correct in hearing that they will no longer have the automatic re-election law, and their comment was that it was very useful, and they probably would like to still see that. And then the second piece was, and this kind of goes back to, I think, the slide from the CDAC committee, but did the election WAC get changed? Is the commission making the proposed changes with or without the WAC change?
I'm not sure what that second question refers to. That doesn't make
and maybe
sense to me.
Dawn, if you want to raise your hand, you can ask that to Bill directly.
Yeah, we can, and then we can address the first question.
I was wondering, did you want me to talk?
Go ahead.
Or no? Oops, I need to put my thing down. Okay. So yeah, the WAC change. You said you were making changes to the proposed manual. Is this based upon the WAC change going through, or is this proposed manual changes happening whether we get a change in the WAC or not, which kind of brings back the re-election policy, you know, and all that kind of stuff, which is in the actual WAC. So it kind of had me wondering, are we trying to make changes without making a change in the law? I might have missed something somewhere, so, you know.
So, yeah, the election manual is a policy document of the commission. It doesn't have the same effect ultimately as the WAC does on requirements for the election. It's more of a guide, right? So it is there to supplement the WAC, but the WAC is the actual law, right? It's the administrative code. So in the conversations we had at the CDAC, one of the things that was brought up was that there's a lot of the WAC in the manual that doesn't need to be there because it's already in the WAC. So the idea was to take out all of that stuff that's already in the WAC that's in the manual, because the manual, when it was originally written, Tom, if he's still on the call, would know, it was designed to be kind of a one-stop shop. Everything you need to know is in the manual. Here you go. Read through the manual. It's got everything in there. And what we found in practice was that's not how folks really wanted to use that, at least the folks that we heard from through that CDAC process. And in the CDAC, with the folks there, it was to take that stuff out that already is in the WAC, make the manual just be a very useful document and not have a bunch of extra stuff there. So that's the concept behind the revision to the manual. And the revision to the manual does two things. One, which is what I just told you, it takes out all that extra stuff in the WAC. And then two, it's supposed to track, or the idea is it's going to track the new changes to the WAC. And like I tried to explain, maybe not too well, it's somewhat difficult to know what those are because they're just in a proposal right now. They haven't been adopted. And as you know, if they get adopted in the timeline I showed you, which is by November, that's right in front of the election process. So to try to wait to change the manual by then is a little behind. We're trying to do everything at the same time so that when the WAC is in place, there's a manual that also is in place as well, a new manual that reflects the changes, also takes out all of the extra WAC stuff that's in the WAC. That's the purpose behind the manual change. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. Makes it clear, basically we look at the WAC, and if the WAC hasn't changed, then we proceed kind of, sort of, business as usual. If it has changed, we go with the new additions or changes in the WAC, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there's the WAC as it is now, right, which you've been operating on for the last 10 years. And if it gets, all the changes get adopted by November, there's going to be a lot of changes, right? And that's one of the things we're going to cover in our training and extensively throughout this next election cycle, because, and Don, you've been around, I think, long enough to know what things were like in 2009 versus 2010, right, when we adopted the WAC.
Oh, yeah. Well before
you kind
that.
of know, yeah, you kind of know, like, okay, this is generally how we do it, and then the WAC came along that kind of put it in writing, right, all the things that we were kind of generally doing in a variety of ways. And that's the same sort of concept. We all kind of know, since we've been doing it under the WAC this certain way, that we're going to continue mostly to do it the same way. But yeah, there will be a little tweaks based on the changes, and we're all going to need to know what those changes are. And you know, their proposals are out there. The final version won't be adopted until hopefully September, and then we'll know right after that exactly what all the changes are, and everyone will know.
So this is kind of weird, but would the legislators be able to make a change to the WAC that happens, like if our election's in March and they make a change in January, but we've already started the process and we only have the incumbent filing, are we going to be able to do the automatic re-election thing from the old process, or are we going to have to go with the new process or be sideways with the legislative change?
Well, so yeah, let's talk about that canceling the election, because you added an extra bit on there, which is more complicated, and I want to get to that, but I want to get at the simple thing first. So, and this goes back to the first question that Josh brought up. So right now, the way the election cancellation process works is you've got to have, it only applies to the incumbent, and you've got to have them filing the candidate information by the deadline and with the 25 nominators. That's the current WAC. The change that's been proposed is to eliminate the nominating petition. So that means any candidate, not just the incumbent, anyone who files, if they're the only person who files by the candidate filing deadline and they're otherwise eligible to be elected, then the election is canceled. That's the change that the CDAC proposed, and that the commission initially said, yes, let's take that out to the districts and to the public for comment, and then ultimately it's been proposed for adoption. Since then, since that was done in December, last September and December, in March of this year, the commission, as I explained earlier, kind of put a little asterisk next to that proposed change and said, yes, we know the CDAC wanted this, and we know it's gone through this process so far, but we're a little concerned about this because we don't really favor canceling the election. Because that takes it out of the hands of the voters, right? When you have that kind of a automatic process happening. But they left it in the proposal, so it's still being moved forward as a proposal. That's where we are now. And
the question on that one, though, pardon me, Bill, the question on that is, if you can't do a write-in candidate, then you have an election with only one person running. So why wouldn't you have the ability to cancel if there's only the incumbent, if there is not the ability for a write-in? And with the current way it's written, there was not the ability for a write-in if nobody else files. File those two things. If only one person files, then you can't do write-ins. You only do write-ins if nobody files.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
So you would be running an election with one candidate.
If no one files. If no one files, then you have an election where only write-ins are going to be able to be elected, right?
Right, but if you have only one candidate filing and that is not the incumbent, you would still be required to run an election where nobody could run against them.
That's what the WAC used to say, but that is another change, because if you're going to cancel the election when you have just one candidate, that is not going to apply, right?
Right.
So that's another one of the proposed substantive changes. And it's based off, if you're going to say now, instead of just an incumbent, that any one candidate who files, you cancel the election, Well, that's fine, but then it changes down the road what happens with write-ins, right?
Right.
So the next part of your question was, what if the legislature takes action on elections, I guess, in the next regular session, so next spring-ish. And yeah, I mean, I'm not the expert on that. I would want to talk to the policy folks to get more detail, but I think, you know, legislature ultimately has the power to change our RCW, right? And they also have the power to give us direction because we're a state agency, an executive state agency. So we are directed by the legislature to do certain things. And they have an ability to tell us what they want to do, and what they want us to do, how they want us to conduct elections. So I think it's an open question as to how much they would want to do that and what they would do. And that would be something you'd want to talk to the policy folks at the commission about. And I think ultimately that was one of the reasons why the amount of pressure and the amount of publicity special purpose districts were getting over the last few years with their elections is one of the reasons why the commission took the action they did in March to kind of, like I said, put that asterisk figuratively on this particular provision, because there was a lot of negative publicity about canceling elections, taking elections out of the hands of the voters. But again, I would have to talk with the policy folks on that for all the details.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, and you know, the kinds of things that you guys bring up, and I didn't say this, but I will now. When it comes up, like these kind of policy issues, these are always things I bring back up to the policy folks and let them handle that side of it. So you can come to me and I'll pass those on, or you can take those directly to the folks, you know, the folks I'm talking about, Ron and Allison at the commission primarily. And you're always free to go to the commission directly, you know, at a commission meeting and talk about elections.
Hey, Bill, I know we're running out of time here. I don't know if you want to take two more or take these offline.
Sure, yeah. We got time.
Okay. This is from Tracy Keir. They usually start their election process on the first Wednesday of November. Are you thinking the necessary changes, will we get the necessary change information in time to do that this year? And then the second question was, okay.
Go ahead.
Yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say yes. The short answer is yes, that's the idea, trying to get this all done by November 1st. I know some folks start earlier than that. I can't think of any change that would happen if you start in October. That would be, you know, that's in the proposal that would screw up your process too much. But if you have any questions about that, just give me a call and we can walk through that. But yeah, for better or worse, it takes a long time to get this WAC change done, and we try to get started sooner, but you know, things happen and things get delayed, and it just takes as much time as it takes. But the good news is it's not hopefully going to be in the middle of January that we're going to adopt these changes, right? It's going to be pretty much at the beginning of the process. But yeah, talk to me. We can talk offline on that. And what's the other one?
The other one is has the discussion over financial disclosure for candidates gone to rest?
I would say we'll talk to the policy folks on that. I would say no. It's always a topic of discussion, but the policy folks have a better handle on that than I do. Yeah.
And then just a closing comment from Tom. He said that WACD is vitally interested in the election issue and will be working it in the next session.